Hello everyone, good morning. This is the group study research presentation of Group 11, entitled Competency of Hospitality Management Teachers for Online Teaching in Taguig City University Towards Quality Education Sustainability. Here's the brief explanation of the chapters 1 to 3. How did online teaching begin in the Philippines? It started because of the news that there is a spreading virus all over the world and it's very lethal and dangerous. If you've got contact with a person who has it, it is called nCoV at first, and the first case came from Wuhan, China, and has spread so rapidly because of the passenger who went to different countries. Later on, the World Health Organization called it COVID-19. That is the reason why we are now in this situation, the new normal education setup. What is the purpose of this study? It is to determine the competencies of professors in the Hospitality Management Program of the Taguig City University, College of Hospitality and Tourism Management, if they can maintain and sustain the quality of teaching the students through online teaching. This is the theoretical framework. The figure shows the knowledge, the importance and attitude, plus the confidence and ability comes to the readiness of the teacher. Comes in Martin et al. 2019 Faculty Readiness to Teach Online Framework, adopted from Rolnick et al. From 1999. And here's our statement of the problem. What is the profile of the respondents in terms of age, sex, position, year level, how long in service, educational attainment? And how do the professor and students assess the level of hospitality management program teachers' competencies in online teaching in terms of online synchronous, asynchronous, and communication? And for the last, is there a significant relationship in the assessment of the two groups of respondents on the aforementioned variables? And we move on to the statistical treatment of data. For the demographic profile, we use percentage. For the variables, we use weighted mean and two-way ANOVA. Move on to the result of the assessment. For the first, respondent assessment, the level of hospitality management teachers' competency in online teaching in terms of online synchronous discussion. For the criteria, we have 5, and the composite of the first is 3.28 with a verbal interpretation of very good. For the second, we have 3.44 for the verbal interpretation of very good. For the third, we have 3.32 with verbal interpretation of very good. For the fourth, we have 2.92 mean with a verbal interpretation of very good. And for the last, we have 3.8 mean with a verbal interpretation of very good, with the overall weighted mean of 3.21 with a verbal interpretation of very good. So the result says, in terms of online synchronous discussion, that the teachers are averagely skilled and knowledgeable in doing online class.
So we move on to the next table. The respondent assessment, the level of hospitality management teachers' competencies in online teaching in terms of online asynchronous discussion. And we have 4 items in the criteria. And the composite of the first item is 3.22 with a verbal interpretation of very good. And the composite of the second item is 3.27 with a verbal interpretation of very good. And the composite of the third item is 3.23 with verbal interpretation of very good. And the last item is 3.35 with a verbal interpretation of very good. And our overall weighted mean of 3.27 with a verbal interpretation of very good. So the result says that the teachers have an average rate in time management and organizing their materials and equipments.
In this criteria, we have 5: the questioning skills, listening skills, feedback skills, dialogue skills, collaborative skills. In the first and second item, we have the same composite mean of 3.23 with the verbal interpretation of very good. For the third item, we have 3.24 composite mean and the verbal interpretation of very good. The fourth item, we have 3.15 composite mean and the verbal interpretation of very good. The last item, we have 3.21 composite mean and the verbal interpretation of very good with an overall weighted mean of 3.21 and the verbal interpretation is very good. So the result says that the teachers have an average rate in communicating in online class.
And so we move forward to the hypothesis. Is there a significant difference in the assessment of the group of respondents on the aforementioned variables? Here's the summary of the assessment. For the criteria, we have online synchronous discussion, online asynchronous discussion, communication. And the composite of the first item, we have 3.21 with a verbal interpretation of very good. And for the second item, we had 3.27 with a verbal interpretation of very good. In communication, we have 3.09 mean composite and verbal interpretation of very good. For the grand mean of 3.19 with a verbal interpretation of very good. But before we move on to the next slide, we would like to introduce the tools that has been used in the hypothesis, which is the two-way ANOVA recommended by our statistician. This determines if there's a significant difference between the mean values of the professors and the students groups in terms of their assessments in the online teaching competencies. So as you see in the table, this is the result of the assessment of the groups of respondents on the aforementioned variables, and it says here that the interpretation of the comparative assessment of the level of teachers' competency in all items is not significant. Therefore, our hypothesis is accepted.
And now we move on to the research recommendation. Ang teacher ay kailangan kasama para sa mga estudyante hirap sa internet connection o kapos sa pera para magpa-load. Ang teacher ang susuporta sa mga estudyante na hirap sa internet connections. Pangalawa, ang internet connection ay kailangan i-improve dahil ito ang pinakamahalaga ngayon para maibigay yung mga pangangailangan ng estudyante tulad ng ginagawang lesson plan o ituturo ng teacher upang mapaayos kahit na walang face-to-face class. Pangatlo, ang teacher ay kailangan gumawa ng lesson o ituturo ng makakaagaw pansin sa mga estudyante para kahit papaano hindi tamarin ang estudyante at magawa ang pinapagawa sa online class.
For the continuation of recommendations, it is better for the students to have the copies of discussion or PDF files from the professor so that they can have advanced reading or refresh the lessons in their heads. Since hindi ganun ka-stable ang internet connection dito sa Pilipinas, kailangan may kopya sila para makapagbasa sila in advance or ma-review nila ang mga lessons para mas maintindihan nila ito. Para sa mga professor naman, pag nagbibigay ng mga schoolworks, magbigay ng tamang instructions at questions kasi minsan hindi akma ang choices na answers dun sa question na binigay. And then, mandatory evaluation of professors should be also done in every end of the semester para mas malaman ng mga professors kung gaano na ba sila kabihasa sa pagtuturo sa online setting. And lastly, ang mga professors needs more training and seminars for online teaching para mas lalo silang magiging bihasa sa pagtuturo ng online setting.
And before we end our presentation, we would like all of you to give a warm of applause for one of the successful achievement of our dear university on having its own new educational equipments given by our caring government of the Taguig City. Thank you and God bless.